Hi, I'm Mark with Crown & Caliber, and welcome to Hidden Gems. There are only so many ways you can make a watch, and that's why styles are ubiquitous throughout the entire industry. Brigade numerals are used by many brands. The same type of hands are used by many brands, whether they're broadsword or Dauphine or Cathedral. And when it comes to the indices, you pretty much have Roman, Arabic, or some sort of geometric. And the California dial is one that was almost lost to time, but purposefully did a mix of those. And the history is really interesting. This is the Panerai 448 Radiomir. So let's get into it. So when we talk about the Panerai 448 Radiomir, we should talk about the history of it. Let's go back to the 1930s. Originally, Rolex made a dial that they called the error-proof dial, which it becomes later the California dial. The error-proof dial was meant as a quick, easy way to read the time. You can tell which way's up very quickly. It's an easy read. The Roman numerals that are all bundled together and harder to read are replaced with Arabic numerals. You have it cut through with some geometrics at the 3, 6, 9, and 12. It is a very easy to read dial. And so for that matter, they patented it. So they were the only ones that could use it. And they used it along with what they call the error-proof hands, which are now known today as the Mercedes hands, that are used in all Rolex sports models from the 50s onwards. But the error-proof dial was at that point relegated to the Rolex bubble backs that are a interesting and somewhat lost to time model that, if you're into vintage watches, are cool, but they're definitely not today's style of watch. And what's really interesting is how it got in the hands of Panerai. So up until this point, Panerai primarily made glow-in-the-dark instruments for the Italian government. And Italy was looking for something their divers could use. Underwater, glow-in-the-dark watches. But the problem is Panerai didn't have a whole lot of experience in making watches. So what they did have is some close connections with the Swiss industrial base. And they went to who you think you'd want to go to make an underwater watch, Rolex. Up to this point, Rolex is the king of oyster watches, as they call them. They're underwater watches. So Rolex went and helped them out. For the first and only time, Rolex made a watch for somebody outside of Rolex. And what they made was the Radiomir. It's called that because it has Radiomir on it, which is a radioactive substance that glows at all times in the dark, that was actually patented and made by Panerai. So with Panerai's Radiomir and Rolex's know-how, they create a diving watch. And with all of the shared material coming from Rolex, some of the dials were made by Panerai and some were made by Rolex. And the Rolex made ones were the error-proof dials. And those are highly collectible, but they start off with the interesting shared history that Panerai and Rolex have. Because eventually Rolex stops making these error-proof dials. And Panerai themselves generally stopped making a whole lot of watches. Then came the 70s and 80s. During this time, there was a renaissance of the interest in the Art Deco scene. And Art Deco watches go back to those 30s and 40s with the bubble backs that had the original error-proof dials. The problem is they had radioactive material in them, and so these watches need to be refinished in order to wear them or read them. And the best refinishers that were working on them were all based in California. So when you bought a bubble back that was redone dial, it came from California. So those error-proof dials started to become called California dials. And that's what we call them today. Nobody started making them quickly or when they became popular in the 70s and 80s. But as Panerai's renaissance happened in the 90s and they became a bigger watch brand that got known around the world, they started to go back into their history of what made them who they are. And one of those things is the California dial. And again, as time went on, they didn't call it the error-proof dial like it was called. They call it that California dial as it became known in the industry. I think what's really cool is this California dial is something that only existed for two brands. It only existed for a small time for those two brands, but it's different from all other dials. It's not something you see often. It's something that when you do see it, pops out immediately. You know it's there. You know it's a little different. It draws your attention, and it is easy to read, just like it was meant to be. And Panerai leans into that history now. They produce great watches with the California dial that look like the original ones. On top of that, others have started to take into this shared history. That's really cool. You have Nomos, which actually does a reverse California dial. And that is a company that didn't exist when it came out originally. And you have things like a little company you may have heard of, Hodinkee, who makes the Swatch System 51 with the California dial. It's becoming more popular. Another company called Bamford actually made a special edition dial for the Submariner with it, which looks fantastic. It's great to see this come back because we don't have too many different styles when it comes to dial design. And it's a fun one. It's one of my favorite ones, and I would love to see more people come out with it. I would love to see more dive watches with it. It is my favorite dial on a dive watch, and we don't get enough of them. But at least we have this one. That's what makes it a hidden gem. Hope you enjoyed learning about the error-proof / California dial of Panerai and Rolex history. See you next time on Hidden Gems.